It was December 1943. The battlefield near San Pietro, Italy, lay silent under a bruised sky. Bodies of soldiers, American and German, were strewn across the frozen hillsides, tangled in wire and olive branches. Among them lay one man who didn't belong to either side of cruelty or hatred anymore. He was a German officer, his face calm, almost peaceful beneath the dust and blood. An American captain, his enemy, stood over him. The captain's name was Henry Waskow, commander of Company B, 143rd Infantry Regiment, 36th Division. He had seen his men die, one after another, on these steep Italian slopes. But when he found this German officer, something inside him stirred. Not rage, not victory, something deeper. Recognition. Waskow looked down at the enemy's insignia, then at the hands, calloused, young, just like his own. He understood that beneath the uniform, this man had been doing exactly what he was, obeying orders, fighting for his homeland, believing he was right. Instead of leaving the German body to rot in the mud, Waskow ordered a small burial detail. No photographers, no reporters, just silence, the wind, and respect. His men hesitated. "You mean bury the crowd, sir?" "Yes," Waskow said quietly. "And with full honors." Rifles were raised. The prayer was said. The flag wasn't American, nor German. It was just a folded piece of cloth someone found nearby. But in that moment, on that blood-soaked Italian hill, two enemies were no longer enemies. It was an act that defied logic, propaganda, and the cold machinery of war. An American officer choosing humanity over hate. History barely recorded it. The newspapers never told the full story. But those who saw it, those who stood there in silence, would never forget the way Captain Henry Waskow saluted his fallen foe, his eyes glistening with something rare in war, mercy. Because sometimes, even in hell, one man can remind the world what it means to be human. Winter in Italy, 1943. The Allied campaign had turned the southern mountains into graves of mud and steel. Each hill, each ridge, had to be taken inch by inch. For the men of the 36th Infantry Division, mostly young Americans from Texas, it was a foreign land that offered no mercy. Rain turned roads into rivers of filth. Mines waited under every step. Machine guns whispered death from unseen ridges. Captain Henry T. Waskow, only 25 years old, had already seen enough death for a lifetime. His men called him Captain Hank. He wasn't loud, wasn't the kind who barked orders. He led with quiet resolve, the kind of leader whose calm presence steadied everyone around him. When he spoke, men listened, not out of fear, but out of respect. The 36th Division had landed in Italy months earlier, facing a relentless German defense. The enemy, battle-hardened troops of the Wehrmacht and paratroopers, knew every hill, every road, every stone wall. They were under orders to hold the Gustav Line, a defensive barrier stretching across the Italian peninsula. If the Allies broke through, Rome would fall next. The tiny mountain village of San Pietro in Fine became a symbol of that struggle. Nestled among ridges, it stood between the Allies and Highway 6, the road to Rome. The Germans were dug in deep. They had turned the town into a fortress. Snipers in bell towers, mortars hidden in vineyards, machine guns waiting behind every wall. For 10 days in December, the 36th attacked. Again and again, they were repelled. The hills were so steep that men crawled instead of marched. Every night, the stretcher-bearers brought back the wounded and the dead. By the 5th day, Captain Waskow's company had lost nearly half its strength. The Germans fought with brutal efficiency. They were no monsters, they were soldiers, trained and disciplined. But they were also desperate. The Führer had ordered them to hold the line, to the last man. To retreat was treason. To die was duty. Somewhere among those German defenders was a young lieutenant, Johann Müller, 26 years old, from a small town near Munich. He had been a schoolteacher before the war. His letters home spoke of his students, his fiancée, and his wish that this madness will end soon. He didn't hate Americans. He had never even met one. But on that hill in San Pietro, he became the enemy. When the fog cleared that morning, Müller led a counterattack down the slope. Waskow's company met them head-on. For hours they fought in close quarters. Grenades, bayonets, hand-to-hand. By dusk, the ridge was carpeted with bodies from both sides. When it was over, Captain Waskow walked through the aftermath. Smoke drifted across the valley. He saw the faces of his fallen men, boys from Texas lying beside German soldiers who looked no older than them. And then he saw Müller. Something about the man's face stopped him. Perhaps it was the faint smile, or the letter still clutched in his hand. Waskow bent down and gently took it. It was written in neat German script. He couldn't read it, but he understood what it was, a letter to someone waiting at home. He folded it carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and gave a quiet order, "We'll bury him properly." That night, under a dim moon, a few men gathered around the German's grave. No hatte, no applause. Just the silence of soldiers who understood what it meant to die far from home. In that silence, Captain Henry Waskow began to change. Not just as a soldier, but as a man who had glimpsed the soul of war itself. The burial of the German officer spread quietly among the men. No one spoke of it in reports. No one dared to mention it to higher command. But in the foxholes, around flickering fires, they whispered about their captain, the one who had buried an enemy with the same dignity he'd give to a friend. For Captain Waskow, it wasn't about making a statement. It was about surviving his own conscience. Every day, the faces of the dead haunted him, not just Americans, but Germans too. All of them young, all of them caught in something far bigger than themselves. Days later, the order came, advance toward Cassino. The Gustav Line still stood, and San Pietro was only one victory in a mountain of defeats. The men packed their gear, boots soaked, hearts heavier than ever. The war machine rolled on, indifferent to grief. But something in Waskow had shifted. He began insisting on retrieving every fallen soldier, friend or foe. "No one stays behind," he'd say. When his men asked why, he only replied, "Because someday, that could be you." In contrast, across the valley, German Lieutenant Johann Müller's comrades had heard of the burial too. Word traveled fast through captured prisoners and local villagers. To them, the American captain who buried Müller wasn't a name, just a rumor, a story of honor in an age that had forgotten the word. Some called him foolish. Others called him noble. By January 1944, the Allied front had bogged down at Monte Cassino, one of the bloodiest battles of the Italian campaign. Rain turned the ground into sucking mud. Artillery never stopped. Waskow's men lived in trenches carved from clay, eating cold rations, writing letters home that never reached Texas. One evening, as night swallowed the valley, Waskow gathered his men for a simple talk. No speeches, no morale slogans. Just honesty. He told them, "Every man you face out there thinks he's right. Every one of them has someone praying he comes home. Remember that before you pull the trigger. Because after you do, you can't forget his face." His men didn't know how to respond. Some nodded, some turned away. War wasn't built for empathy. But Waskow's words lingered in the cracks of their minds, like an ember that refused to die. A week later, hell returned. The Germans launched a counterattack at dusk, shells screaming across the valley. The ridge that Waskow's men held was pounded for hours. Dirt and fire rained down. The radio lines were cut. They were isolated. Company B against the mountain itself. Waskow crawled from trench to trench, checking his men. When a mortar struck near their position, he was thrown into the mud, ears ringing. A sergeant yelled for him to stay down. But Waskow stood back up. "Get the wounded out first," he ordered. Then came the bullet. A single shot from somewhere in the dark. It struck him just below the neck. He fell without a sound. The men didn't realize at first. Amid the chaos, orders still echoed, gunfire still crackled. Only when the smoke cleared did someone find him. His body resting beside a half-dug trench, eyes open to the sky. The night grew still again. Word spread like a wound. "Captain's gone," someone whispered. His men couldn't accept it. The one who had buried an enemy with honor was now one of the fallen. They carried his body down the ridge. 5 men, silent, stumbling under the weight of something heavier than flesh. At the base of the hill, they laid him beside the other dead, waiting for transport. A war correspondent, Ernie Pyle, was there that night. He would later write one of the most haunting pieces of war journalism in history, The Death of Captain Waskow. He described how the men came, one by one, to say goodbye. One soldier knelt and gently touched the captain's arm. Another whispered, "You sure was a good man." And then, one by one, they cried, not out of weakness, but because they had lost the only man who still reminded them of their humanity. Somewhere far above them, beyond the front, the story of the burial had already faded. No one remembered the German officer's name. But now, 2 men, one American, one German, lay beneath the same Italian soil, their stories forever entwined. In war, heroes are often remembered for the enemies they killed. But Captain Henry Waskow would be remembered for the one he buried. The war machine didn't pause for grief. The day after Captain Waskow's death, Company B was ordered to advance again. There was no time for mourning, no space for reflection. Just orders, mud, and the grinding sound of trucks climbing another nameless ridge. But the men carried more than rifles that morning. They carried the memory of a captain who had taught them, through quiet example, that even in a world gone mad, one could still choose decency. When they reached the next village, the battle was already raging. The enemy was dug into stone houses, their machine guns rattling from shattered windows. The air reeked of gunpowder and death. Private Lewis, one of Waskow's youngest men, froze behind a wall, trembling. A veteran beside him grabbed his shoulder. "Remember what the captain said," he murmured. "Do it right." Lewis nodded, swallowed his fear, and moved. Hours later, the Americans took the ridge. When it was over, they found themselves standing over rows of German dead. And there, among them, lay a sergeant, barely older than Lewis, his helmet dented, his face half covered in dirt. Lewis knelt beside the body. For a long time he just stared. Then he said softly, "He could have been me." Without orders, the men began digging graves. The chaplain was miles away, so they did it themselves, just like the captain had. No speeches, no vengeance. When the last mound of earth was patted down, Lewis stood back and saluted. It was awkward, imperfect, and wholly human. The gesture spread. Across the front, from San Pietro to Cassino, acts of quiet respect began appearing in the middle of slaughter. Soldiers sharing water with prisoners, carrying wounded enemies on stretchers, leaving notes for families found on the bodies. None of it made the newspapers. But it was real. Months later, when Ernie Pyle's article about Waskow finally reached home, it broke through the noise of victory reports and propaganda. Readers across America wept over breakfast tables. They saw, for the first time, the price of decency in a world that rewarded brutality. Mothers in Texas wrote to the army asking about him. Soldiers in Europe carried copies of the article folded in their pockets. It reminded them that humanity hadn't entirely drowned in the mud. Meanwhile, in Germany, the family of Lieutenant Johann Müller received a notice. Missing in action, presumed dead near San Pietro, Italy. They never knew that their son had been buried with honor by the very enemy he had fought. But decades later, after the war, an Italian farmer found the site of the graves and told his story to visiting veterans. When American and German researchers traced the records, they confirmed it. The unnamed German officer had been Müller, buried by Captain Henry T. Waskow himself. That discovery turned what had been rumor into truth. The families of both men exchanged letters. They wrote not of politics or victory, but of sorrow, pride, and the hope that their son's final meeting meant something greater than war. For those who fought alongside Waskow, his example became a kind of compass. They no longer spoke of him as just their commander, but as the conscience of their generation. The phrase, "do it right," became their quiet oath. And when the 36th Division finally marched into Rome months later, some men carried small wooden crosses carved from the same trees that shaded the German officer's grave. They left them along the road for every soldier, friend or foe, they passed. The brutality of the Italian campaign had consumed thousands, but the story of one captain and one enemy officer pierced through the darkness like a single candle that refused to die. In that moment, far from home, surrounded by ruin, a few soldiers remembered that they were not just instruments of war. They were men capable of grace. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world celebrated with fireworks, parades, and photographs of generals shaking hands. But in the quiet hills of Italy, there were no cheers. Only wind over old graves and names carved on weathered stones. Among those names was Captain Henry T. Waskow, buried first beneath Italian soil, later brought home to Texas. His family received his belongings, a rusted wristwatch, a few letters, and a small folded paper in his jacket pocket. The paper had faded German handwriting, the letter he'd taken from Lieutenant Johann Müller's hand on that cold December morning. No one knew what it said. No one ever translated it. His sister, Lois, kept it sealed in a box for decades. It belonged to both of them, she would say. And maybe it should stay that way. The story of Waskow and Müller was almost forgotten, buried under decades of new wars, new heroes, and new enemies. Yet somehow, it survived, through Ernie Pyle's words, through the memories of the men who had followed their captain, through the whispers of veterans who never quite forgot what decency looked like. For many who fought in Italy, that small act of honor became a lesson that outlasted the war itself. It wasn't about politics, strategy, or victory. It was about the moment when one man refused to become what war demanded of him. Years later, an American historian visiting San Pietro found the remnants of the burial ground. The field was quiet, overgrown with grass and wildflowers. He knelt, brushed the soil aside, and placed two flags there, one American, one German. Then he said softly, "They both did their duty, and they both remembered they were men." That, perhaps, is what made Captain Henry Waskow's act so powerful. He didn't try to change history. He didn't even know anyone would remember. He simply looked at his fallen enemy and saw himself. He buried him not because he was German, or because he was human, but because it was right. And in doing so, he buried something else with him. The illusion that war can erase dignity. When we talk about World War II, we speak of grand battles, Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway. But the true victories often happened in silence, between two soldiers who would never meet again. Waskow's men said later that their captain had changed the way they saw the enemy. They no longer spoke of Krauts or Huns. They spoke of soldiers, fathers, sons, teachers, farmers, men who, under different stars, might have been their friends. Today, the hills of San Pietro are peaceful. The scars of war have faded, but beneath the earth, the echoes remain. Two men, once enemies, now share the same ground, their bones washed by the same rain. And somewhere, perhaps, the world still turns a little gentler because one American captain chose to honor his opponent instead of hating him. Because in the end, wars are remembered by their victories, but humanity is remembered by its mercy. And on that winter night in 1943, when the bugle was silent and the stars hung low over the Italian hills, mercy had a name. Captain Henry T. Waskow.